The letter was written late at night, under a dim bulb that flickered every few minutes. The soldier paused often, staring at the paper as if the words themselves were heavy. Outside the barracks, the war hummed quietly, boots on gravel, distant engines, the low murmur of men who knew tomorrow was not guaranteed. He wrote carefully, slowly, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew this letter might be the last version of himself that ever reached home. He told his mother he was eating well. He told his wife not to worry. He told his young daughter that he'd bring her something beautiful from far away. He did not tell them where he was going. He was not allowed to. When he finished, he folded the letter neatly, slid it into an envelope, and wrote an address he knew by heart. For a moment, he held it against his chest. Around him, other men were doing the same thing, writing, folding, sealing pieces of their lives into thin, white envelopes. These letters were hope. These letters were proof of existence, and many of them would never arrive. During World War II, letters were more than words. They were lifelines. For families back home, the arrival of mail meant survival. He's alive today. For soldiers, writing home was a way to remain human in a world designed to erase individuality. But between the hands that wrote the letters and the homes that waited for them, there was silence, censorship, secrecy, and decisions made far away from kitchens, porches, and waiting hearts. Every letter passed through unseen hands. Some were opened, some were blacked out, some were quietly removed from the system entirely. No explanation, no notice, just absence. A mother in Ohio checked her mailbox every afternoon at the same time. She had done this for months. Her son had written regularly short notes, cheerful lies, reassurances meant to calm her. Then one day, the letters stopped. At first, she assumed delays. The war was large. Mail took time. She waited patiently. Days passed, then weeks. Neighbors told her not to worry. Mail is slow during wartime, they said. She nodded and smiled, but at night she reread his last letter until the paper softened from her hands. He had written, "I'll write again soon." Soon never came. Across the country, similar silences spread. Wives stared at empty mailboxes. Children asked questions no one could answer. Fathers pretended calm while counting days since the last envelope arrived. The absence was never announced. It simply appeared. In military offices, stacks of letters were sorted with mechanical precision. Some were delayed, some were censored, and some those tied to classified movements, secret units, undisclosed locations, were quietly pulled aside. No stamps, no return addresses, no delivery. The soldiers who wrote them often never knew their words were intercepted. They assumed silence meant distance, not erasure. They continued writing, pouring thoughts onto paper that would never reach its destination. "I miss home. I'm scared, but I'm okay if anything happens to me." Those sentences stopped mid-thought more often than anyone realized. In one case, a soldier wrote 3 letters in 1 week. None were delivered. His family received a telegram months later, brief, cold, official. No mention of letters. No explanation for the silence that came before the loss. To the family, it felt sudden. To the soldier, the goodbye had already been written, just never received. Some letters weren't stopped because of death. They were stopped because of knowledge. If a soldier moved through a town that wasn't on any map, if he witnessed something classified, if he belonged to a unit that officially did not exist, his words became dangerous, and dangerous words do not travel. In quiet rooms, far from the front lines, officers made decisions that would echo for decades. They weighed security against humanity. They chose silence. They chose control. They chose to let families wait instead of letting truth slip through ink and paper. No one informed the families. No one explained the delay. Silence was easier. Back home, people created their own explanations. He's busy. He's on the move. The mail must be backed up. Hope stretched thin, but refused to break. A young woman kept every letter her husband had sent, tied with a ribbon in a wooden box. When the letters stopped, she continued writing anyway. She described the weather, the garden, their son learning to walk. She mailed each letter faithfully, believing that somewhere, somehow, he would read them. Most of them were returned unopened. Some disappeared completely. She never knew which. Years later, long after the war ended, archives would reveal rooms filled with undelivered mail letters, never sent forward, never sent back, words trapped in time, final thoughts sealed away from the people who needed them most. But at the time, families lived inside the waiting. The silence became a presence of its own, heavy, unspoken, sitting at dinner tables, lying beside empty pillows at night. And the most painful part was not knowing whether the silence meant death or something worse, that the words still existed somewhere, but were deliberately kept away. For the soldiers, the act of writing was an act of faith. For the families, the absence of letters became a wound that never quite healed. And between them stood a system that believed history was safer without certain truths. The letters that never arrived were not lost by accident. They were swallowed by secrecy. And in that silence, thousands of goodbyes were never heard. The waiting changed people. At first, it was patient. Then it became ritual. And finally, it turned into something heavier, something that settled into the bones. Mailboxes were checked twice a day now. Morning, just in case. Evening, just in case the carrier had been late. Curtains shifted when footsteps passed outside. Doors opened too quickly, only to close again in quiet disappointment. The silence stretched. Inside military offices, the process continued with efficiency that felt almost cruel in its orderliness. Letters were sorted by unit, by location, by classification. Some passed through with red lines, carved across sentences, entire thoughts erased, emotions reduced to fragments. Others were never marked at all. They were simply removed. A clerk would hesitate sometimes, holding an envelope longer than necessary. A familiar handwriting, a return address from a town that felt real. Then the envelope would be placed into a different stack, a stack that did not go forward. No explanation followed. No record was kept. In homes across America, people began to measure time differently, not by dates, but by absence. It's been 12 days since the last letter, 3 weeks, a month. A mother stopped setting an extra plate at dinner without realizing when it happened. A wife stopped sleeping on her husband's side of the bed and told herself it was for comfort, not fear. Children learned not to ask questions because the answers always hurt. Silence does not arrive loudly. It seeps in. Some families received telegrams, brief, impersonal notices that delivered news without context. Others received nothing at all. No confirmation, no closure, just an endless, unanswered waiting. And the worst part was this: silence looked exactly like hope. Because as long as there was no official word, anything was still possible. Soldiers continued writing. They wrote because it was the only thing that made sense, because the act of putting words on paper reminded them that someone, somewhere, still knew their name. They wrote after missions, after losses, after nights when sleep refused to come. One soldier wrote about a sunrise he saw over a ruined town. He described the way the light touched broken buildings, how it reminded him of home. That letter never left the base. Another wrote an apology he had rehearsed for months. Words he was finally brave enough to say. That envelope was opened, read, and quietly destroyed, not because it was dangerous, but because he had written where he was. Secrecy had no room for tenderness. In some cases, entire units were flagged. Any correspondence tied to them became restricted. Their movements were classified, their existence blurred. Letters tied to those names were treated as risks, not messages. The men never knew. They waited for replies that never came, assuming delays, assuming loss. Some wrote again, asking gently if the last letter had arrived. Others stopped asking altogether. The silence worked both ways. Back home, families tried to continue living. Birthdays were celebrated with empty chairs. Holidays were endured rather than enjoyed. Photos were rearranged on mantels to make absence feel less obvious. A woman in California kept a notebook by her bed. Every night, she wrote a letter she never sent, copying the habit her husband had taught her before he left. She believed, quietly, stubbornly, that writing kept him alive somehow. Across the ocean, a soldier sat on a crate under a dim light, waiting for a reply that would never come. He reread his last letter and wondered if the ink had faded before it ever reached home. He did not know it had been stopped. Time passed. The war shifted. Front lines moved. Victories were announced. Losses were counted. And still, the letters remained trapped in silence. Some were stored. Some were destroyed. Some simply vanished. Years later, historians would stumble upon forgotten rooms filled with mail, thousands of envelopes tied with string, never opened, never delivered. Addresses faded, ink bled with age. Final words sealed away long after they mattered most. But in the moment, no one knew. Families blamed themselves. Did I say something wrong? Did he forget me? Silence invites doubt. It corrodes certainty. A father told his son not to expect letters anymore. The war is complicated, he said, though he did not understand it himself. The boy nodded, pretending to be older than he was, learning early that some questions do not have answers. The emotional weight accumulated quietly. It did not explode. It sank. Some soldiers survived the war and returned home, only to discover that their letters had never arrived. They asked about messages they had written months earlier. Families shook their heads, confused. Gaps appeared in shared memory, entire conversations missing. How did you not know? How did you not tell me? There was no one to blame. The silence had already done its work, and for those who never returned, the damage was permanent. Families found letters years later, copies, drafts, unsent words tucked into belongings, sent home after death. They read sentences that should have arrived earlier, when they still mattered, when they could have offered comfort instead of pain. The realization was devastating. He had written, she had waited, and something in between had decided they should never meet. The war ended. Parades filled streets. Flags waved. History moved forward. But for many families, something remained unresolved. A silence that had never been explained. A goodbye that had never been heard. And beneath it all, the quiet truth. These letters were not lost in chaos. they were withheld, and the cost of that silence would echo for decades. The war ended loudly. Sirens, church bells, headlines screaming victory. Soldiers returned in waves, some whole, some broken, some never returning at all. The world celebrated survival. But silence does not end when a war does. In homes across America, drawers were opened years later. Old boxes were moved while cleaning basements, while downsizing, while preparing to leave houses that had held too much memory. And inside those boxes, people found things they did not know existed. Unsent letters, returned letters, letters stamped undeliverable with no explanation. Words written in the middle of the war, frozen in time. A mother unfolded a letter dated 3 weeks before her son was declared dead. She read his handwriting steady.com, hopeful, and collapsed into a chair she had sat in for decades, suddenly unsure how many years she had actually lived without him. A wife found a letter hidden inside a Bible her husband had carried overseas. He had written it the night before a mission he never returned from. She had waited for words that had been in her house the entire time. The silence broke all at once. Historians began to uncover fragments of the truth long after it mattered. Declassified documents, forgotten storage rooms, postal logs that made no sense until someone looked closer. Entire batches of mail had been intercepted, not lost in battle, not destroyed by bombs, but deliberately stopped, sometimes for security, sometimes for secrecy, sometimes simply because the system had no room for humanity. The government did not announce this. There were no apologies, no formal acknowledgement. The war had been won, and history had moved on. But families had not. For many, the discovery came too late. Parents were gone. Wives had remarried or grown old. Children had grown into adults, believing they were forgotten. And now, in yellowed envelopes, the truth waited patiently. He had written, she had loved. They had both been silenced. Some families tried to piece together timelines matching dates of letters with known battles, trying to imagine where their loved one had been when they wrote those final words. It was an impossible task. Too much time had passed. Too much had been erased. Others could not bring themselves to read the letters at all. They stayed sealed, untouched, because opening them felt like reopening wounds that had never healed properly. There is a particular cruelty in delayed truth. Grief, when it arrives late, does not soften with time. It hardens. It becomes heavier because it carries the weight of everything that could have been different. A soldier's daughter, now elderly, spoke once about finding her father's last letter decades after the war. If I had read this sooner, she said, I would have grown up differently. I would have known he didn't leave us in silence. That knowledge changes people. The war is often remembered in numbers. Battles won, casualties counted. Years passed, but history rarely pauses on what was never received. It does not linger on the nights spent waiting by doors that never opened, on the hope that stayed alive longer than it should have, on the letters that carried love across oceans only to be stopped inches from completion. These letters were not weapons. They were not strategies. They were human. And that is why they were dangerous. Because they reminded people that behind every uniform was a voice that wanted to be heard. Behind every order was someone who missed home. Behind every victory was a cost that could not be measured in territory or treaties. Today, some of these letters sit in archives. Others remain in private homes. Most are still missing. They exist as ghosts in history, proof that what is erased is often just as important as what is recorded. And somewhere between the writing and the waiting, something was lost that can never be returned. Not just paper, not just words, but the chance to say goodbye. This is why the war did not truly end for everyone in 1945. For some, it ended years later. For others, it never ended at all. Because silence, once learned, is difficult to forget. And the letters that never arrived still speak, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to remind us. History is not only made of what happened, it is made of what was never allowed to reach home.